There are wars that shape nations, and then there are wars that create them. The American Revolutionary War was not just a clash of armies, it was a spark that turned a colony into a country. A bold, almost impossible experiment, that ordinary people could govern themselves without a king. But America wasn't born overnight. It was dragged into existence through anger, rebellion, and blood. And to understand why, we have to go back to the 18th century when America was not yet America at all, but Britain's prized possession. By the mid-1700s, the British Empire was at its peak. Its navy ruled the seas, its trade stretched across oceans, and its colonies supplied everything from sugar to tobacco to faize. The 13 colonies in North America were flourishing. Population was booming. Towns like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York bustled with life. Farmers grew crops that fed Europe, merchants built wealth, and settlers pushed deeper into new lands. But here's the problem. While the colonies grew in wealth and confidence, Britain still saw them as dependents, subjects not equals, and that meant London made the rules. After Britain's costly victory in the 7 Years' War against France, known in America as the French and Indian War, the empire was deep in debt. To raise money, Parliament turned to its colonies. The Stamp Act of 1765 demanded taxes on every piece of printed paper, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. To the colonists, this wasn't just about money. It was about power. They had no representatives in Parliament, yet they were being taxed by it. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry. Britain repealed the Stamp Act after protests, but it didn't stop there. The Townshend Acts of 1767 taxed imports like glass, lead, paint, and tea. Once again, colonists erupted in anger. And then came the boiling point, the Tea Act of 1773. Parliament gave the struggling British East India Company exclusive rights to sell tea in the colonies, undercutting local merchants. To many colonists, this wasn't just unfair, it was an insult. In Boston, protest turned into spectacle. A group of men, disguised as Native Americans, boarded ships in the harbor and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was loud, defiant, and impossible to ignore. King George III and Parliament reacted with fury. They imposed the coercive acts known in America as the Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston's port and placed Massachusetts under direct British control. To the colonies, it felt like tyranny. To Britain, it was punishment. But instead of breaking colonial resistance, the crackdown united them. For the first time, the 13 colonies began to see themselves not just as separate provinces, but as one people facing the same enemy. In April 1775, the spark became fire. British troops marched out of Boston, ordered to seize colonial weapons stored in Concord, Massachusetts. But colonial militias, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers had been preparing. At dawn in the town of Lexington, they faced the redcoats. Someone fired. Nobody knows who. But history remembers it as a shot heard round the world. The British pushed forward, but as they retreated back to Boston, thousands of militia swarmed the countryside, firing from trees, walls, and houses. Dozens of British soldiers were killed. The colonies were now at war. The colonies moved fast. They formed the Continental Congress, uniting leaders from across America. Among them, John Adams, Samuel Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington. Washington, a tall Virginian planter and former officer, was chosen to lead the new Continental Army. It was a desperate gamble. This wasn't a professional army, just a collection of volunteers with muskets. Britain, on the other hand, had the best-trained military on earth. But the colonists had something Britain didn't, the conviction that they were fighting for their homes, their rights, and their future. By 1776, the debate shifted from reform to revolution. On July 4th, the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, was adopted. It declared not just separation, but a philosophy that government exists by the consent of the governed, and that all men are created equal. For Britain, this was treason. For America, it was destiny. The next years were brutal. Washington's army was driven out of New York. In the freezing winter of 1777 at Valley Forge, soldiers went without shoes, food, or proper shelter. Disease spread, morale sank, and survival seemed impossible. But Washington refused to give up. His greatest strength wasn't battlefield brilliance, it was perseverance. He kept the army alive when collapse seemed certain. And then came a turning point. In October 1777, American forces won a stunning victory at the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. A British army, marching from Canada, was surrounded and forced to surrender. Saratoga changed everything. It proved the Americans could stand toe-to-toe with Britain, and it convinced France, Britain's old rival, to join the war. With French money, weapons, and most importantly, a navy, America's chances of victory soared. For years, the war dragged on. Battles raged across the colonies. Cities changed hands. But by 1781, the endgame was near. In Virginia, British General Charles Cornwallis dug in at Yorktown. Washington saw his chance. With French forces under General Rocambie and the French Navy blocking the coast, Washington surrounded the British. For 3 weeks, cannons pounded the British defenses. Finally, Cornwallis surrendered. Yorktown was a decisive blow. Britain had lost the will to continue. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. If the Revolutionary War was America's birth, then the War of 1812 was its first great test. This wasn't about declaring independence. That had already been won. This was about defending independence, about proving to Britain and to the world that the United States was not a fragile experiment, but a nation that could stand on its own. But the war that followed was messy, confusing, and often overlooked. To Britain, it was just a sideshow. To America, it was a fight for survival, dignity, and respect. By the early 1800s, the young United States was still finding its place. The Revolution had ended, but America was surrounded by giants Britain, France, and Spain, each with their own empires and ambitions. At the time, Europe was engulfed in the Napoleonic Wars. Britain and France were locked in a global struggle for dominance. And caught in the middle was the United States. American merchants wanted to trade freely with both sides. But Britain had other plans. To strangle Napoleon's France, the British Navy blockaded Europe. That meant American ships heading for French ports were stopped, searched, or seized. And worse, Britain began a practice known as impressment. British ships would intercept American vessels, drag sailors off, and force them into service in the Royal Navy. Thousands of Americans were kidnapped this way. To the U.S., it was nothing less than an insult to sovereignty. On land, tensions were rising too. Native American resistance, especially in the Ohio Valley, was fueled in part by British weapons and support. To many Americans, it felt like Britain had never truly let go, as if the empire still wanted to keep America under its thumb. By 1812, the pressure was too much. President James Madison, pushed by a group of fiery young congressmen known as the War Hawks, asked Congress to declare war. America was going back to battle with Britain. The War of 1812 was chaotic from the start. The U.S. launched invasions of Canada, hoping to strike Britain's colonies to the north. But these early campaigns were poorly organized. American forces were defeated at places like Detroit and Queenstown Heights. Instead of conquering Canada, the U.S. found itself on the defensive. At sea, however, things were different. Though tiny compared to the Royal Navy, American warships scored surprising victories. The USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, defeated the British ship Guerrier in a stunning duel. These victories boosted morale and proved that the American Navy could punch above its weight. Still, Britain's naval power was overwhelming. Soon, British ships blockaded the American coast, choking off trade and leaving ports in ruins. Then, in 1814, came the war's darkest moment. With Napoleon temporarily defeated in Europe, Britain was free to send more troops to America. In August, British forces marched into Washington, D.C. The city was barely defended. President Madison fled. First Lady Dolly Madison famously saved a portrait of George Washington before escaping. And then, the British set fire to the Capitol, the Treasury, and the White House itself. Washington burned. It was a humiliation. The capital of the United States, torched by the same empire they had broken free from just decades earlier. But from the ashes came resilience. America refused to surrender. A month later, the British turned their sights on Baltimore. But hey, the story was different. At Fort McHenry, American defenders held out through a massive bombardment. Cannons roared through the night. Rockets lit up the sky. Watching from a British ship was a lawyer named Francis Scott Key. He saw the American flag still flying at dawn, battered but unbroken. Inspired, he scribbled a poem, The Star-Spangled Banner. Those words would later become the United States national anthem. The war's climax came in January 1815 at New Orleans. British forces launched a major assault on the city, hoping to cut off America's trade on the Mississippi. Standing in their way was General Andrew Jackson, a fiery Tennessean who had scraped together an army of regular soldiers, frontiersmen, free black men, native allies, and even pirates. Against all odds, Jackson's forces crushed the British in a decisive victory. Over 2,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, while American casualties were fewer than 100. The win made Jackson a national hero. It also gave Americans a sense that they had won the war. But here's the twist. The battle happened after the war had technically ended. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, had already declared peace. News just hadn't reached New Orleans yet. On paper, the War of 1812 was a stalemate. Neither side gained or lost territory. The Treaty of Ghent essentially reset things to how they were before the war. But perception mattered more than reality. For Britain, the war was minor, a distraction from the far bigger struggle in Europe. But for America, it was transformative. Twice now, the young nation had gone up against the world's most powerful empire. Twice, it had survived. The war gave the U.S. a new surge of confidence. Historians call it the era of good feelings. Andrew Jackson rode his fame all the way to the presidency. And Francis Scott Key's anthem became a symbol of resilience. Most importantly, the war cemented America's independence. No longer just a fragile experiment, the United States had proven it could fight, survive, and endure. The American-British wars tell a story bigger than battles and treaties. The Revolutionary War gave birth to the United States. The War of 1812 proved that birth was not a fluke, that this new nation could defend itself against the greatest empire of the age. Together, they shaped not just America's identity, but the world's understanding of what a republic could be. It was messy, it was brutal, and it was far from perfect. But from Lexington to Yorktown, from Washington's flames to New Orleans' victory, these wars carve out a space for the idea of America, and that idea would only grow stronger.